Now you may remember this particular Yagi from a few videos back, and I was impressed with this one. I did buy it second hand for around £5. It didn't cost a lot of money at all. I have since changed it to an SMA connector just to make it easier to use, but I've been playing around with this particular design over the last few weeks, and in particular concentrating on the driven element. Now I've made a few prototypes around this driven element. I've just been building Yagis with one or two parasitic elements, and I'm going to do a separate video on some of the driven elements designs that I've come up with based on this one, just to see how good they are. But in this video I want to show you how to make a small Yagi antenna with just one parasitic element, which should give around 5.5 dBi of gain. So it's not particularly powerful, but because it's so small, it fits in a backpack, and you can use it to extend your coverage over, say, a dipole antenna. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you one design that I'm impressed with, that I've come up with building off this driven element here. I've changed a few things, but only the materials that I've used. All the measurements are the same. So let's get the tools out and I'll show you how to make this little Yagi antenna. And there's also a little twist at the end as well to add a little bit more gain and make it, still quite portable to fit in a backpack. So as I said, I've been playing around with this Yagi design over the past few weeks, and this is one that I've come up with, and I've made a few of these just trying to get the construction method down, and where something that I'm happy with the construction method. But they're all based off this driven element here. So you've got the reflector here at the back and the main driven element here with the balun going back here, and it does work really well. So that's what I'm going to show you today. I'm going to be using brass because I've got a little bit of brass here in the workshop, but you could use aluminium as well, especially for the main body and the parasitic elements, because we're going to be screwing them down. But you would still have to use something like brass or copper for the main driven element, because you need to solder in place there your coax, and you can't solder to aluminium. But let me show you the materials that I'm going to use, and then I'll talk you through the construction. So I've got 3 lengths of tubing here, all with different diameters. I've got some 6mm diameter tubing here, and we're going to be using that for the back reflector. I've got some 5mm tubing that we're going to be using for the parasitic element, and I've got some 4mm tubing that we're going to be using for the main driven element. So let's make the main driven element first with the 4mm diameter tubing. So the measurements for the main driven element, this is this piece here, are pretty straightforward. You've got 23mm here, and then you've got 30mm here on the body. So we're going to use the tubing to construct one side of this first, and then the opposite side. I'm not going to try and construct it all in one go. I'm going to do it in 2 halves. Now when you start using a ruler and you're measuring out each individual piece, that's when you can start getting errors in your measurements. It's a lot more accurate if you get yourself some plastic straw and do the measurements just once. And I've measured out 2 lengths here. We've got one at 23mm and one at 30mm, and we're going to use this straw for our measurements. So I'll just place that over there, and then I know that here is exactly 23mm. So that's what we're going to use to measure out the main driven element. Taking the time to get 2 lengths of tubing absolutely spot on with some digital calipers really does save you a lot of time, and you will get much more accurate measurements that way. So I've got my tubing in this vise to help me. As you can see, I've got my little measuring tool in the vise here, so I know if I put a cut just here, that leaves me 30mm of tubing for the driven element here. So what I'm going to do is only cut halfway through this tubing, because I want to put a right angled bend in it. So I've got a little hacksaw blade here, butt it up to the plastic straw there, and I'm just going to put a cut halfway through the tubing. So I've cut just about a little bit more than halfway. I can cut it a little bit more later if I need to, but I've got my second length of tubing here, 30mm, so I'm going to put that up just against the cut there, and then I'm going to take my hacksaw blade and cut straight through here. That way I've got a length at 30mm here and then 23mm here that I can put the bend in to make the one side of the driven element. So now that I've prepared my two lengths for the main driven element, I'm going to move on to making the back reflector out of the 6mm tubing. And I'm going to be using the exact same method, but this time obviously some larger diameter plastic tubing, and I've measured this off at 68mm. Doesn't have to be so precise with this measurement. If you end up measuring it off at 70mm, 72mm, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but I'm going to be using this buttered up, and again using this plastic tubing to help guide my hacksaw. Now, instead of using a hacksaw, you could probably use one of those pipe cutters. I do have a couple of pipe cutters, a small one and a medium-sized one, but I've never had much luck with those. I don't know if it's because my pipe cutters are extremely cheap off eBay, but I've never had a great deal of luck at you know, cutting a nice cut all the way around brass tubing, but maybe it just works better on copper tubing because copper's a little bit softer than brass. I don't know, but I think I'll invest one day in a more professional one and just see if that works out better for me, because I've seen plumbers make some really nice cuts with those little pipe cutters, but I'm just not able to do it with the ones that I've got. But this method is pretty straightforward and you get a nice even cut all the way around the tubing. So I've got my back reflector cut out here, as you can see, but with this particular build I want to do something a little bit different that I didn't do on this one. I'm going to drill two holes, one here and one here, and I'm going to use two screws to attach it to this brass boom here, and that's instead of this one that's just in the middle here, because I also want to drill a hole through the side here so I can feed my coax through that hole, and I think that'll work out better than just it sitting over the top of the reflector here. I think it'll lay a lot nicer if I drill a hole through here and then holes at the top here, one here and one here, to attach it to the brass boom. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to drill three holes into the reflector, one a little bit wider to fit the coax through, and then two smaller holes to fit the screws through. So I've just put a little dot in the centre of this tubing here, and I'm just using the brass box tubing that I'm going to be using for the boom, just to mark out where I'm going to put the two little holes for the screws, and I think this is going to probably work out about right. I'm going to drill these two holes first, and then I'll line up and drill the wider hole through the centre of the reflector. So I'm about to drill the holes out in the reflector, and you can see where I've punched the where I want the two holes to be, here and here. If you don't punch holes in tubing like this, then your drill will just slip all over the place. And I have in the past just used a normal drill to do this kind of thing, and it is possible, but you've just got to really take your time doing it just to get it as straight as possible. So that's the back reflector prepared then. I've got the two holes drilled there so I can fasten it down to the boom, and as you can see I've also drilled a hole through the middle there so I can feed the coax through. It's just going to be a much neater alternative than having it sitting over the top. So next I'm going to move on to the boom then, and it's a square piece of brass box tubing, 12.5mm square, and I've measured it off at 75mm long. And what I'm going to do now is use the back reflector as a template. I'm going to fix the back reflector in place with some masking tape, then use the two holes that I've already drilled in the reflector as guide holes to drill the holes into the boom. So I've got the holes drilled out in the boom there, and I'm going to be using these 2.5 M2.5 brass screws to hold the elements in place. Now I don't have anything so small to make threads in this, But what I've got here is a little self-tapping screw, and what I've found is if I screw that down, get it tight, and then keep doing that a few times, then I'm able to make a thread in here that I can then go ahead and screw these down onto. So, you know, you can use glue if you wanted to, I suppose, to hold these screws in place, but it's just a lot better with the threads. So I've gone ahead and drilled a hole so we can attach the Yagi to a tripod. Now what I've gone ahead and done is I've got some Perspex bar here that fits on the inside of the box tubing, and I've threaded the Perspex bar, so what I can do is insert this and then epoxy it in place. But you can also tap out the threads directly onto the brass bar if you want to. The hole in here is just a little bit bigger than the holes for the threads, but I have tapped out this stuff before directly with the bar, and you know, there's enough threads on there to attach it to a tripod. But what I would normally do is cut this off about here and then epoxy it on the inside. But I'm going to epoxy it on the inside, but keep about that much sticking out of the end, because I've got something I want to show you towards the end of the build that's going to be a little bit different with this one. But for now, what I'm going to do is give this a good clean up with some wire wool, and then I'm going to move on to preparing and soldering together the main driven element that's going to sit on top of this bar. So now I'm going to put together the main driven element. Now I've prepared some coax here. I've got about 400mm long, and I prepared the coax, as you can see here, with the outer braid and the inner core to make this T section here. I've also cut away some of the insulator here to expose the outer braid, because that's going to, when I've soldered it in place, that's going to make contact right at the bottom of the driven element here. So it's going to be soldered together like so. This is going to be soldered to the two ends of the tube down here, and this T-piece is going to be soldered in either end of this dipole antenna here and here. So what I'm going to do is get some masking tape to hold this down, solder in place these two sections first, and then solder in place that section at the back there. So that's the main driven element all soldered up. It's soldered in position here and here, and I've also soldered it at the back here. So now I'm going to remove this and then attach it to the boom. So I'm just screwing down the back reflector onto the boom, and I think that's tight enough. You can see the screws coming through there. So what I'm going to do now is attach the driven element that we've just made. Now, to enable me to attach this to the boom, I need to isolate the base of this from the boom. I only want it to make contact back here on the reflector itself. So I'm going to use some heat shrink tubing. I'm going to wrap that around the boom, and then I'm going to fix that to the top of the heat shrink tubing. So all of this is not in contact with the boom, only the back bit here is in contact with the boom and the back reflector. So now I've got the heat shrink tubing in place. I've just threaded the coax through the back reflector hole here, and you can see that the heat shrink tubing is covering everything from here all the way back to here. And what I'm going to do now is super glue this driven element in place. It'll make good contact with the heat shrink tubing, and it'll be plenty strong enough to hold that driven element in place. Just hold a little bit of pressure on there while the super glue does its job. And finally, I'm going to add the first parasitic element here, and the parasitic elements are all 45.5mm long, and the parasitic element is 32.5mm away from the driven element. So I'll just screw this one down, and that's this Yagi finished. And finally, I'm just going to tidy this area up here with a little bit of epoxy putty. And somebody asked me what type of epoxy putty I used in the last video. I think it was the last video where I did the cloverleaf antenna. And at the moment, I'm using some Araldite epoxy putty. This is really, really nice stuff. I did have some Loctite epoxy putty, but it wasn't very good, and it crumbled when it set. But this stuff is really solid, but not so hard that you can't shape it after it's dry if you want to. But I tend to find if you mould it into position and then dip your finger in a little bit of isopropanol alcohol, you can get it really smooth, and then you don't tend to have to get in there with a file to tidy it up. And finally, to finish the Yagi off, I've got a little end cap here, but I've cut away some of the material because we've got the two screws poking down there. So fit that into the back, and it just finishes the back off quite nicely. So essentially this is the Yagi antenna finished, and it's just a 3-element Yagi. And if you look at most calculators online, 3-element Yagis tend to give around 5.5 dB of gain. So, you know, it's not too powerful, but it's small enough to carry around. It's not, if you get this out in a coffee shop, it's not going to look like a big full-size Yagi and look a little bit silly. But with this Perspex rod here, I've designed it so we can add to this. And what makes this Yagi design so interesting is that all the parasitic elements are spaced out the same distance apart. So if we connect this connector up here with 2 more parasitic elements, then essentially we have a Yagi that is now around 8 dB of gain. And again, if we take another one with 2 parasitic elements here, connect that one up, also we now have a much bigger Yagi antenna that should operate at 10 dB of gain, or just under 10 dB of gain. So I think this is a really interesting idea. I haven't seen anybody else come up with this, but having something like this that you can carry around in your backpack and break it down so it doesn't take up quite so much room, and you know, if you're not going for distance, you just scan with this element Yagi here, and then if you need a bit more, you can stick another section on like so, and then a bit more, you can stick the final section on, and you can go, you know, as long as you want with this really, and make it as long as you want within reason. I tend to find that the cut-off point for a decent Yagi is about 19 to 20 elements. But what I think we'll do is give this a test, just looking at one access point, and scan it just with this section of the Yagi antenna first, and then add the other sections one by one, and see if we can see on the scanning software an increase in that access point, that we're picking up a better signal by adding these extra 2 sections in here with the extra 2 elements on each section, and see if we can actually see that in the real world. So let's give this a try then and see if we can pick up the differences when I add the extra elements. So there's the test signal there, Belkin 54G, and it's currently at 58%. We'll put that onto a graph. You can see it's spiking up a little bit, but it tends to settle around 50%. So now let's add the first 2 elements. And we've got a little bit of a jump. Looks like it's settled just under 60% there. Just over 60% now. It's settled down a little bit more. So we've certainly seen a jump by adding the 2 extra elements. It's gone back down just below 60. So now let's add the final 2 elements. So now it should be working as around 10 dB. And then we've got a big spike there at around 70%. So we definitely see the 3 spikes at just with the single parasitic element. It's operating at around 50%. Add those extra 2 elements, just under 60%, add the final 2 elements, and it's operating around 70% there. So the theory is correct that, you know, the extra elements there, and 70% probably is working at around 10 dB, maybe just under 10 dB. So I'm pretty pleased with that. So this was just something that I wanted to do for myself and just make myself a bespoke Yagi antenna out of brass. And the idea came to me of adding these kind of extenders to the Yagis because I've recently posted a picture on the Facebook group where I show a test jig that I've come up with to test different Yagi elements, all based around this similar design. And also I've built a secondary device where we can add different sets of parasitic elements just to test them on the network analyzer. So I will be testing the driven element on this and a few other ideas that I've got in a separate video on the network analyzer, but I just wanted to show you the build for this in this video, and I'm pretty pleased how it's come out. It does seem to work really well by adding the extra elements there. I mean, I could tighten this up or find some way to lock it in place because it is a little bit loose, but as long as you don't tip it up, then it's not going to fall off. But as an idea to extend the gain of a Yagi, you know, when you want a little bit more gain, just adding some extra elements on like this, I think is a pretty solid idea, and something that maybe I'll look at in a future video to build on this. And let's see how far we can go with a Yagi antenna, because you can only add so many elements before they start interfering with each other, and then it just makes the antenna work worse. You know, the performance does drop off. So we'll do experiments on showing that as well. But if you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up. I've made 3 of these for this video. One that I'm giving to a friend, one that I'm keeping, and this one here on the bench is going to be given away to the Patreons next month, so it will be the end of August. But any comments or questions, drop them below and I'll do my best to answer them, and hopefully you'll join me on the next one.